Says it's starting, and we're off.
We're good. Well, welcome everyone from around the world and here in London. My name's Adam Crimble. I'm one of the conveners for the Digital History Seminar here at the IHR, and we are very happy tonight to have Melodee Beals, who is a lecturer of history at Loughborough University, and she is going to be telling us about one of her latest projects on 19th century newspapers, which she's called Boutique Big Data. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So thank you, Adam, and thanks to the conveners of the Digital History Seminar for their kind invitation to speak tonight, and to all of you here and those of you watching this 6 to 9 months in the future. Tonight, I'm going to be reflecting upon my current research project, my methodology, how it developed, and how hopefully it will develop in the future. Most importantly, I would like to make the case to all of you for collaboration between boutique, institutionally funded digital history projects, and how we can bring them together to form large-scale projects through our own individual researches. So let me begin with a slight description of my historical problem and my research project. The genesis of the scissors and paste project, which is what I'm currently working on, was several years ago when I, with typical postgraduate indignation, found an error in a book I was reading. The error was quite small. The author had misattributed a single newspaper article to the Edinburgh Advertiser when in fact it had appeared originally in the Scotsman a week earlier. And I took this quite personally, that he had declared that the Edinburgh Advertiser felt a particular way about Australia, when in fact it was the opinion of the Scotsman, word for word. Now, in the end, it's not really his fault. The book was written several decades ago, and he was doing a project on the Edinburgh Advertiser, not on all perceptions of Australia in all Scottish newspapers. And although scissors and paste journalism is well known to periodical scholars, the idea that most newspaper articles that aren't local history, local news, are cut and pasted from other newspapers, this concept is recognized by periodical scholars. It's usually noticed by most historians who spend a lot of time with newspapers, but it's not really well researched. The actual mechanics of how it worked are largely a mystery. Now, we know what it looked like. We know that there was an editor or a specific reprint editor hunched over a desk, looking over various subscriptions, cutting out the best articles, putting them into his own copy. There are lots of anecdotes in other newspapers and in fiction and plays about reprint editors. There's even a case in Sweden where an editor is sent to prison for a libel case, and they won't let him have any sharp implements while he's in prison, and he says that it is cruel and unusual punishment to take scissors away from an editor. So this is a well-known concept, but how they chose the individual articles, how they made decisions about how much to include, how much to truncate, it's really just piecemeal work. So what I wanted to do was to look at scissors and paste journalism on the large scale, to figure out how it worked, where the networks of reprints were, and basically create, in my wildest dreams, a database of all reprints, so no historian working on a discrete project would ever misattribute a journal article again. So the problem, as I've noted here, is that the scale of reprinting in the age of reprinting, which is the 1820s to the 1840s, is absolutely immense. It is the vast majority of newspaper articles. So how do you go about finding which are reprints and which are not? Well, you could rely on the honesty of the editors, but attribution was incredibly inconsistent. Sometimes they say it's from the Times, usually they don't. And the problem with this is they're not being duplicitous. This was perfectly acceptable practice. It wasn't under any kind of copyright law, and everyone expected that you would copy and you would be copied. Some newspapers were actually quite flattered when they got picked up by bigger or more important newspapers. We also don't really have all of the network components. Newspapers that have survived to the present day, let alone been digitized, are very, very small. We don't have every issue of every newspaper, so we can't be sure what pathways they all took. And let's face it, historians only have, at best 90-year-old lifespans. We can't really hope to go through every single newspaper in the history of mankind and find all the reprints. So these were the different problems that I was facing when I was going for my goal of creating a reprint database. And so I came up with a quite complicated methodology on how I was going to go about this. And this is what I would like to talk to you about today. With the plethora of commercial, state, institutional, and personal digitization projects, there are people all over the world who are digitizing their own local newspapers. There must be something we could do to avoid misattribution with confidence as to the origin of newspaper articles and actually the evolution and the pathways different versions of that article took. So for the next 30 minutes or so, I will take you through my attempt to disentangle the mysteries of 18th and 19th century reprint culture. And I'll move from the most basic forms of what I would call digital due diligence to a full integration of boutique and big data projects. And so for the first part of my paper, I will be talking about the first half of this flowchart, and I realize it kind of goes left to right, right to left, left to right. But how you work with the big data project and then how that scales down into close reading and institutionally funded or personal research projects. So the first step, of course, is to get some sort of transcription of the newspaper articles you want to trace attributions and reprints from. Now, one of the most profound crimes of the digital revolution was the creation of who experience ever shrinking travel budget, just like doing research in their pajamas. It has created a number of problems. First and foremost is the misuse of the full text search engine. When undertaking a project in cultural or social or economic history, it is very tempting to go to, for example, the Times or the British Library newspaper collection, type in the keywords of your research and get that killer quotation that just sums up the mentality that you're trying to convey. And that is a very uncritical way of using not only newspaper material. And I think with looming deadlines, everyone's been tempted to maybe do a quick scan to see if they can find the title for their conference paper. A lot of difficulties with this because it's wider conversation. Whether or not it was a reprint or reprinted later, whether or not it alluded to, these matter when using particular quotations in your research. Digitize has been something that historians have long been guilty of since there were indices to various newspapers, notably again the Times. If you are able to a particular topic in a newspaper, it is the path of least resistance, and it's something that historians have done for a long time, because it's not because of any kind of nefarious. But this causes quite a lot of problems when reprints are recognized and you kick the bucket, We Do the Rest article, where he traces the origin and evolution of jokes in Victorian newspapers, where they began usually in the American press for his research, and how they developed as they were reprinted in other locations. But as Nicholson has noted, and many others have noticed, it's difficult to trace reprints. Now that we have full text searching for a lot of these newspapers, it would seem like basic due diligence to go and type in bits of that article to try and find other copies of it, see if it was printed earlier or later. But it's very difficult to actually find reprints in this manner. The optical character recognition that's used is not precise enough, and the article that you're looking at, you may say, this is the key phrase. Surely this phrase appears in all versions of this article. And really that may not be the case. So you can search for a long time and not find dozens of reprints that are actually there, just because it is a bit hit and miss. The other problem with this is that it leads to the creation of hundreds, if not thousands, of personal repositories. How many historians across the world have notebooks, filing cabinets, laptops, and old hard drives filled with notes they have taken from periodicals over the years in various forms of text documents, Excel documents, Word Perfect that can no longer be read on some computers. And there they sit, maybe to be used by that historian, but probably to lie neglected unless that historian's library is taken. There are not only databases that we have to deal with that are online, but the ones that we have digitized but can't access because they're on individual computers. So search and transcribe is the start to finding reprints. A very basic amount of due diligence. You find an article you're going to use in your research, you try to find out, but it causes as many problems as it solves. So depending on the size of your personal repository, it might actually be that an individual researcher has come across numerous reprints without even knowing it. It actually happened to me in the course of my PhD research. I had a laptop hard drive filled with partial and full newspaper article transcriptions, many of which were reprints that I'd taken transcriptions of so far apart in time, I hadn't realized I was retyping the same article over again. So there are several ways that you can go about finding these reprints within a offline digital corpora. The way I think is probably most effective is the use of plagiarism detection software that allows you to find copies. Now, while you could use something like Turnitin, I don't think the Turnitin Corporation would really appreciate us filling up their databases with 18th and 19th century newspapers, although it certainly would make dissertations much more interesting, getting red flagged all over the place. The most effective plagiarism software that I found to date is something called CopyFind, or WCopyFind for the Windows version. It's created by this man, who is a physics professor at the University of Virginia named Lou Bloomfield, who is my personal hero and favorite person in the world for creating this program. It is a highly customizable search. It's open source, so if you want to make it even more customizable, you can actually open the program up and alter it, and it's completely free. So I really do love this, and I'll tell you why I love it. First of all is that it works with both offline corpus. So you can put a directory of text files into it. You can also put in a list of website addresses, and it will search those web addresses against your text files. It was developed to study student plagiarism, but it's very useful in this way as well. The other reason I really think it's very, very helpful is that unlike most Ngram programs that look for 4 or 5 word chunks, it doesn't have to take out stop words or punctuation. You can choose. Do you want all those little grammatical words? Do you want all the punctuation? Do you want the numbers or the things it doesn't think are words? And that comes to play a really important part, because a lot of reprints change the number to the the word to, or it will abbreviate things, it'll add punctuation version. So you can have the nice graphical interface of Windows, or you can have the command line one, which is slightly more powerful and a lot faster, which I'll get to in a moment. So it works really well with very neatly organized corpora that you have on your own computer, your own text files. And when you run it through the computer, you get something very similar to this. You get a plain text version of this as well as an HTML version, and it is a table of your results. And as you can see behind me, hopefully, it indicates right and left perfect and overall matches. And although you can have it look for whole words, I usually set it to character by character analysis. So if somebody has changed the spelling of the word, changed the abbreviation, it still comes up very, very easily. So you can look and see how much of it is the same at the beginning of the article or the end, and help determine whether or not it is a positive match. And it takes into account errors and exclusions. So you can have it have a lot of fuzziness to it if you are working with imperfect transcriptions. Then also links to a side-by-side comparison, which I'll go through in a bit more detail in a moment. But it lets you look at the two different versions of the article, highlighting what it thinks are the matches or the near matches. So you get a visual representation very, very quickly. This is very similar to the program Juxta, if anyone has ever used that. Although Juxta is really for using two things you know are the same. You're looking at different editions of this. Lets you go through hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of that same level of comparison. And it can be used on the command line, as I said, because it can be huge files if you have a very large corpus. And probably the most important part about it, and the reason that it has made my research possible, is that it works really well with badly OCR or optical character recognized text. That is the key problem with a lot of reprint finding, is that the same word, the exact same phrase and sentence could have been rendered completely differently depending on how the computer analyzed that text. And through the genius of Lou Bloomfield, this is really good at getting around these OCR errors. So what I have been able to do is, with the kind permission of the British Library, I have been able to access the OCR'd transcriptions of the 19th century British newspaper collection. And for anyone who has had the privilege of viewing the XML or the encoded version of these transcripts, they're really quite terrifying. Every single word has a three-dimensional coordinate around it so that it can be highlighted on screen with the image. That's great for highlighting images, but it's absolutely terrible for text mining. You get lots of extra code that you don't need. So the first thing I had to do was to remove all of that through XSLT, so that it was just plain text documents of just the raw text of the articles of the newspapers themselves. This really put all the metadata into the title of the file. So if you saw here, London Courier, January 2nd, very, very simple metadata, but that's all I needed to be able to find that article again. So once I've run this new giant corpus of OCR text through the program, I get a very similar readout as I had before. Now this is the results I had when I ran the year 1820, which had 8 different newspaper titles in the collection, many of them daily, some of them weekly newspapers, a lot of pages of newspapers. It actually took 3 days the first time just to do that first year. I have since found ways to speed it up. The text files used represent whole pages of periodical text as opposed to individual articles. So the percentages that you see here are actually quite low compared to when I was doing my article repository, but 5% of a whole page is still a hefty bit of text. Files are all labeled by the date and page number so I can find them again. And the way it's tested is every individual page of the collection is tested against every other page of the collection, regardless if it's the same newspaper or the same issue. And this gave me a really robust, everything in the collection had been tested. Windows copy find takes about 30 hours to do a single year. The command line version took about 4 hours. So if you can learn the command line, it makes a huge difference to your electricity bill. There were many false positives because I was quite liberal in what I told it considered a match. But it's unclear how many false negatives there were. Again, without going through every single page of the corpus, I haven't found any from my case studies where it's missed very many, but there have been a few. And I'll explain why in a moment. So if you look at the sample side-by-side comparison, and I do apologize profusely if anyone in here has red-green color blindness, the green is in italics and the red is just underlined, so I hope that helps a little bit. If you look at this side-by-side comparison, you can see how forgiving Bloomfield's software actually is of OCR errors. There are words that are clearly not words on one side, a series of random letters on the other, and they are in fact a match. When I went back and looked at the original images of these two articles, they came out perfectly. Now this is a pretty human readable one. There were some where it was just a string of characters. I had no idea that they were truly a match, and it was. So it's very forgiving of patterns that the OCR makes out of what should be letters. I can tell you that there are a couple of places where this can be detrimental, and that is in tables. So a lot of newspapers that have any kind of actuarial or wage tables, this, a million comes up a lot of times, and that'll cause a lot of false positives, unfortunately. But for plain text, it seems to work really well. All of this is hyperlinked, so if there are several matches on a single page, you can click on the one match on one side and it'll scroll to that bit on the other page. If they've reorganized the paragraphs, which sometimes they do, naughty editors that they are, it'll help you figure out which order the paragraphs eventually ended up in. So the question is that I threw this corpus into my plagiarism detection software. I received 200,000 matches for 1 year. How important is the human in all this? Can I go through every match? Can I refine my testing parameters? Is this just something fun to do and say, look, I made pretty colors? What is the human element in this big data project? Well, I don't know fully yet, but I can say that there are some things where the human element is quite small, things that you can do directly with the data that you retrieve. Unfortunately, the thing you have to do before you can retrieve that data is you have to decide how much of it you want to actually put into your visualization. 200,000 hits clearly has too many false positives. Reprinting is rampant in the 19th century, but it's not quite that rampant. So you have to decide how to make it likely candidates as opposed to just raw matches. Now you could just lower the parameters on the search in the plagiarism tool, but I found that takes out a lot of the OCR fuzziness. So I actually developed different rules that seem to work a little bit better. Through 3 separate test runs of 1800, 1810, and 1820, just to give a fair run of this larger sample, I put in simple filtering rules, and it was a lot of trial and error to see if I cut out too many true matches. The first thing I did is I removed any internal reprints. So if something was from the same newspaper, I took it out. In all the research I've done, I've only found one newspaper who was absent-minded enough its own article twice by mistake, and as opposed to greatest hits. So I removed all the internal reprints. This also got rid of a lot of advertising, ads that would keep running over and over again. I restricted the match size to 90 characters right 90 characters left or 160 overall. So it had to have most of the same article from one direction or the other, or bits and pieces around 90 and 90. This was heavily trial and error. I started off with about 400 and I missed a lot of articles. I went down to like 50 and I got a lot of nonsense. 90, 90, and 160 seemed to have the best ratio. I also had to restrict the date separation. If two articles were more than 200 days apart, I've yet to find an article that was actually reprinted in the newspaper press. Magazines could take years to show up again, but within newspapers, they generally did it within 200 days. After that, every match I found was an advertisement or just a mismatch. Again, trial and error, but it seems to work pretty well. So once I put these rules in place, tested them over several different year groups to make sure it was consistently meeting my expectations, it took it down to about 10%, or about 22,000 hits, which is still a huge number for an individual person to go through, but is more manageable and probably more representative. And once you have that, you can do some statistical analysis. Now, I want to make it really clear to you that these are drawings, not graphs. I make that proviso because although I've used, to the best of my ability, sound statistical models, I had to make some adjustments to make it visually understandable. And therefore, if you were to try to do proper social network analysis statistics on these, you would have some anomalies. That I will try to explain my graphs a little bit for you. So what this represents is the network within the British newspaper 19th century library collection. These are all the titles that appear between 1810 and 1817. If you notice, Liverpool Mercury is not connected in the first one because it doesn't start until 1811. What the closeness in 1810 represents is how strong the connection is. So two titles or two nodes that are physical proximity to each other share a lot of the same content. They have lots of matches. I kept that physical proximity throughout the rest of the decade, and I just changed the width of the edges, the width of the lines, to demonstrate the number of matches in later years, so that the nodes weren't jumping around the whole screen. You get sort of a constant image. And what this really tells me is that there are certain periodicals, Oxford Journal, Leeds, Ipswich Journal, Hull Packet, that have a huge amount of shared content. And as the decade went on, that content became much more evenly distributed, and then towards the end of the period became more concentrated again. And as you can see, that is the Napoleonic War. So there is a reason probably that the content became less local and more distributed. The other thing that's important to note about these diagrams is it does not exclude advertising. Advertising, which I'll speak about in a moment, does throw up some anomalies, but it is interesting, and the networks that it forms are interesting in their own right. So I wouldn't want to exclude them, maybe separate them into two different charts in the future. But it does give you a general idea of how these networks evolve over time. And hopefully when I have the entire century done, it'll give a much clearer idea of how networks change with new titles and new technology. So what these network diagrams illustrate, or what they obscure, is the fact that digitization projects have nothing to do with how these networks actually functioned in the 19th century. I can make network diagrams all day long for the rest of my life, and I'm limited by the fact that these are the newspapers that happen to be in this particular collection. They were chosen to be representative, not necessarily to be connected to each other. So it's actually amazing that there are so many connections between these journals that are chosen to be a wide berth of society. So how do you go about fixing that problem? How do you go about putting those missing nodes back into your diagram once you've run this kind of analysis? Well, all the periodicals that are digitized and made machine readable, you could theoretically add them together into one giant corpus and run them together. You would probably need a supercomputer, or at least technology to move on a bit more than it has on the personal computer. But it is possible. Unfortunately, they're held by different commercial, state, and as I said, personal repositories. But these are not insurmountable problems. These are problems that can be changed in the future. One way to really go through this is to take what we get from the individual corpus analysis and to manually curate those missing nodes, to go to other providers and look for those different articles. And this is either by doing search and transcribe, as I described beforehand, or by going through physical hard copies of non-digitized newspapers for around those dates looking for those articles. This is a tedious process, but it is one of the best ways we know of for getting a complete pathway of a particular article. There are some pitfalls also moving between national repositories. As I'll talk about in a moment, I was looking for an article about a very specific death by laudanum, a suicide. And when I searched for it in the American database for the correct dates, I had a different highly publicized suicide by laudanum, but not the one I needed. So there were difficulties when doing national or colonial or international news. How do you make these search terms really find what you want and not just a similar story using the same keywords? The other problem with comparing databases that I hope will someday be solved is the difficulty with translation. So much of the reprinted content was taken from or to French-speaking periodicals especially, that having some sort of translation plagiarism detection software is eagerly awaited by scholars of all centuries. It gets mentioned at every conference I've got to, this mystical plagiarism detection. But maybe someday when Google Translate is a little bit better and these plagiarism detection softwares can actually find reprints in multiple languages. So you have seen what I've attempted to do by looking through these individual text files, creating these large-scale network diagrams. And what I have decided is that advertisements are a much bigger problem than I originally anticipated. The age of reprinting was also the age of the penny press. So most of the newspapers that engaged in heavy reprinting also engaged in heavy advertising to keep their doors open. Front page, back page, hidden fake articles that were testimonials inside the middle pages. This is how they paid their operating costs, and it makes our work that much more difficult. Looking at page level matches is really helpful because often newspapers stole several things from one page. It helps find matches, but it makes it hard to take the advertisements out. A lot of commercial providers tag individual articles as being advertisements, but not all do, and they're not always catching those hidden testimonials in the middle of the newspaper. So because of the formulaic nature of commodity advertising, such as ship advertisements, you're also getting hits that are actually entirely different advertisements, but they use a stock letter to advertise their products. So this adds a lot of white noise. I would encourage anyone out there who really is into advertising history and brand history that this is a fertile ground to explore, and I'm very happy to share my data if you will help me take advertising out of my data. So that is my basic view of the big data side of my project, looking through these large corpora in order to find reprints, OCR errors, and despite differences in storage technology. So that brings us back to my methodology. Having unpacked the collections, analyzed them for reprints, made some lovely pictures, what else can we do with this? Well, that's when the real history begins, in my opinion. Not that big data isn't real history, but you have to have that second step. The point, this is the point where there is a full reintegration of the case to distant reading analysis. The boutique data really comes to the fore. By pulling out selected case studies, we can begin to understand those finer mechanics of the reprinting process that remain so elusive when we just have funny anecdotes about Swedish editors and their shears. So the one part of the reprinting process that seems particularly difficult to analyze data perspective is directionality. Although we can find matches of individual articles, unless we go who is copy whom, and that doesn't count for the various branches and evolution that an article might take. So hopefully by looking at case studies, we can start to pick up directionality hints and industry standards that will help us feed back into finer analysis of the big data later. So what I will talk to you about is how you work with the case study data and how you reintegrate that back into the large scale analysis. So when I first began this project, I was terribly certain, as most recent postgraduates are, that I was the only person to have ever noticed my historical problem or thought sufficiently about it to suggest a solution. With my introduction into the blogosphere and Twitter, I found out, like most recent postdocs, that nothing is new under the sun. Reprinting is, of course, well known. It's often discussed. Northeastern's Viral Text Project had just recently begun and had lots of funding behind it. And there was a certain buzz in circles that dealt with reprinting about modeling possibilities. But the core question I wanted to answer still remained elusive, and that was directionality. Finding reprints or memes in modern parlance is pretty straightforward if you have the computer power to do so. Understanding the step-by-step evolution of news text is a different matter. Now, this is a phylogenetic chart. It is a chart of evolution. This is the tree of life on the planet Earth. It's probably the best one I can show you. But the idea of branching off of text, the idea that a version has a slight change to it and that gets copied and changed slightly again, this is well known to literary scholars, and editions of novels and poems have this sort of treatment done. The question is, how do you do that with reprinted news material, which has no attribution, no central repository of bibliographic data? So what we have to do is we have to look at successful traits, things that get passed on in different versions of articles, to try to sort of retro-engineer industry standards and cultural trends, and maybe that'll help us identify directionality on a larger scale in the future. So the first article I did this for was something called Another Dreadful Massacre by the Natives of the Marquesas. I went through it in extreme detail in some other papers, which are all available on YouTube if you want to hear the story once again. But basically, it was a rousing, ripping yarn in the South Pacific, and it was printed originally in the Sydney Gazette. It reappears in several London newspapers, and then later in the Scottish press over the course of about a week once it hits Britain. It always gets shorter as it gets reprinted, and they don't add a lot of commentary to it. The one thing that was really important about this particular pathway was the fact that there were three major types of changes. The first was the shortening. People in the provinces published less frequently, so they had less space than the dailies of London. So they often shortened the article down, which was quite lengthy in the original Sydney Gazette. Two, they're quite passive-aggressive about changing spelling or grammar errors, sometimes vocabulary. There were lots of different words used to refer to the individuals in the original Sydney Gazette, and it all got changed to Islanders by the time it got to Aberdeen. So there was a shortening of vocabulary. The third thing that changed was the headline. There was no headline in the Sydney Gazette. It was just part of a big block of text. When it got to London, it was called Another Dreadful Massacre by the, except in one case where it said British vessel plundered. And by the time it got to Aberdeen, another got dropped. So it was just Dreadful Massacre. What was interesting about it is that the British vessel plundered was the only accurate headline. There was no massacre anywhere in the article, but it died out. It was an unsuccessful trait for this article to have. So spelling mistakes are also unsuccessful traits. People tend to fix them as they reprint. So this gave me an idea of how this reprinting worked. So the next article that I did that I would like to show you is an affecting instance of self-murder. Sensational articles always will get reprinted slightly more frequently than run-of-the-mill articles. The Dreadful Massacre is a fun case study because the story was printed all over the Anglophone world for several years, popped up in literary digests 10 years later, little traits that have been picked up and lost. But even local news gives us a really good place for experimentation. In this particular article, it's only printed 3 times that I've been able to find, in the Morning Chronicle, the Flying Post, and the Examiner. And the Morning Chronicle gives a very lengthy account of the coroner's inquest, how she had had a very tumultuous and forbidden love affair. She had finally recovered from this and met a new man, but determined she couldn't live with him, that their marriage would be doomed, and therefore committed suicide in a female boarding house. Several doctors came to revive her, and she thwarted their efforts to save her. It's a very long and involved case. Has a similar news cycle as the Sydney Gazette. About a week, it pops up over the place and then dies down. So local or colonial, about a week is the news cycle. And the editorial choices made in the 3 papers are very, very different, even though they are essentially using the same official text in order to make their story. So this case study was not part of a larger project. It was randomly chosen from my big data project. And once I found the 3 hits, this one was a match for this one, which was a match for the third one, which was again a match for the first one. I took really careful transcriptions of all 3. Space for space, punctuation mark for punctuation mark. And I reran those through CopyFind on their own, just to see what the difference between these 3 individual versions were. And these are the results. The top one just gives a raw comparison of the top 3. The Morning Chronicle is the original because it is the earliest date that I could find. Then came the Flying Post and then the Examiner. And by using the overall match, you are able to tell which ones are copying from which. So even though it goes 1, 2, 3 date-wise, you can tell by the character changes that actually both are copying directly from the Morning Post. It's easier to tell with the Dreadful Massacre story because there's 15 different versions and you can see quite big differences in the different copies, but it pans out here as well. When you look at the version that is in the Flying Post, I've given line by line, character by character description of the changes. And almost all the changes are punctuation. He's just applying house style, using semicolons instead of commas or vice versa, using capital letters for the headline instead of lowercase or sentence case. The only big difference is 6,900 characters are removed and 853 are added. And this is basically a summary. He has taken those 7,000 characters and made it about 10% of the size. But he's done actually a really good job. He's taken a bit from everywhere and summarized it in a nice and neat fashion. The same cannot be said for the Examiner. The Examiner makes all sorts of changes, capitalization, punctuation, and vocabulary changes. They both passively aggressively change complete from EAT to ETE. Spelling mistakes never survive. But the major difference is they've taken out text from throughout the article, not in one big chunk. And what they've done is they've taken out all reference to the woman's alcoholism, to her history of mental illness, and to any connections that her mother had with mental illness. And basically, they've left in the story of the mean man who broke her heart. And it makes for a much more pathetic and empathetic image of this woman. It's actually the one I read first. I had a very different picture of her after I read the Morning Chronicle version. So they have made very strong editorial choices using essentially the same text. They've not added any different words. They've just been very selective about how they've cut it out. So we can tell by the raw character count and the dates that both copied from the Morning Chronicle. The Examiner has bits of the Morning Chronicle that the Post doesn't, even though it came later. But we can also say that while the Flying Post was cut for space, the Examiner was clearly editorialized. And this appears again and again in different case studies. Certain newspapers editorialize their reprints, other newspapers summarize for space. And they are very consistent. There is a house style for how you handle reprints. And this is going to be very helpful once I have a large enough collection of these industry standards to help us design search parameters in the future. So, in the end, since the project began, I've taken a dozen or so careful case studies like this, and the most important thing that's come to my attention is it's all a matter of scale. Case study searches are limited by time and access to relevant collections. They are augmented by clever search strings and human intuition. Maybe if I just phrase it this way, I'll find it this time. But they're also hindered by those human intuitions, taking you down maybe human biases. OCR reprint matching is limited by the OCR quality and the reprint matching resolution, whether you use whole articles, whole pages, or just engrams, individual statements. And the thing I've really found out, especially with the Marquesas article, is every single version I've done, every single resolution has picked up new articles. One method is not better than the other. They all pick up different types of articles at different stages. And that's why I would really make the case for bringing individual case studies back to big data. After I had made my OCR, my manual transcriptions of all of those different articles, I put them back into WCopyFind against the larger corpora, and I found more matches. So although it was very good at matching OCR to OCR, adding in that high quality resolution source material found even more matches. And what was really annoying about this particular match I found is it made me remap my entire map of the Marquesas story. As I said before, I thought there was this very clear pathway through London to Scotland. There was one article with a good headline that died out. And if you can sort of read on here, preservation of Captain Fowler and his crew by an island chief. Another unsuccessful headline that speaks quite positively of the Marquesa natives. So my idea that there was one bad headline or one unsuccessful headline was wrong. There was actually another, and I only found it by using case study material back against the big data. So, boutique big data. My pitch for this paper, my hope for future research is simply this. If we take those individual case studies, those projects that we are all taking part in as we do our historical research, whether it's with periodicals very specifically or whether we simply use periodical material in our wider historical research, that work, that effort that you've gone through should not be lost. If we have some sort of shared transcription standards, whether that's text encoding initiative standards or something more historically focused that we come up together with, that allows us to collaborate and to share our data. Now, it does require a bit of collegiality. It does require the idea that you don't store it up until you die and then they can have it. But there are numerous benefits to doing so. Many of my favorite case studies have come about because people have given me bits of their data to play around with, and I've found new and interesting points in the first instance to help them with their research, but also to help mine. I also make all of my data available publicly, and it's been used in teaching and in research in other institutions. And they've done really interesting things with my data that I hadn't even thought about doing. So there are huge dividends to sharing this information. And most importantly, if you are working on an institutionally funded project, if you don't necessarily have the big AHRC grant, it doesn't mean you can't make that discovery that really changes how we look at big data and how we work with it in the future. So this website is called scissorsandpaste.net. There's a little bit of an advert at the end of my paper. I do apologize for being so blunt about it. But basically, the transcriptions that I have produced in the course of my research and all the metadata and all the reprint data that I've discovered thus far is put up here in this sort of hopefully easily navigable website presence. It's also available in its raw data form at my GitHub, which stores not only the raw XML data filled with juicy metadata, but in lots of more usable forms, plain text or in Excel table format of various different aspects of the data. And my plea to those of you who are watching online 6 months from now or who are in the room today is to consider donating your newspaper transcriptions to my database or to making your data more available in the future. You don't know necessarily how your data might be used or what other people's data might contribute in a collaborative process. So if you are at all interested, I do have a selection of cards to remind you of the website addresses. And I would really love to talk to all of you, my methodology and how it's worked out, or about collaborative projects between boutique individual projects. Thank you very much.
I'll just pass these around, actually. Richard, can you pass those if anybody like one of Melodee's cards? Unfortunately, you're not going to be able to get that if you're listening online, but you can go to scissorsandpaste.net. Thank you very much, Melodee. We have a bit of time for some questions before Melodee has to go back off to Loughborough. And I'll just start with a really simple one, actually, which is whether or not what you're looking into is really just a matter of retweeting in the 19th century way, as opposed to when you but this is devious because we see, I think, copyright or stealing ideas and selling them on for profit. But I wonder, just in terms of the content, is this the 19th century version of Twitter?
Pretty much. I mean, it might be similar more to blog and blog posting, but reposting. I mean, people posting in the newspaper to get information, they could. People knew that they would be reprinted and they wanted to be reprinted. In America, actually, is founded upon the idea that's how a fledgling writer makes it, is get reprinted as many times as possible, write something that's going to be quite salacious. But yeah, it's
clickbait, isn't it?
It is. It's clickbait all over. And fortunately for me, Lada Ademic in the United States, who does a lot of research on Facebook memes and things like that, she's developed her own set of rules for how they develop. And it's almost identical to how these newspapers get changed as well. Again, with spelling mistakes not surviving, but also what type of articles move on and how much of the article moves on. It's eerily similar to modern memes.
I'll open the questions from the floor. Open for questions from the floor.
Are you looking primarily, I mean, in the future, are you hoping that this will expand beyond newspapers to the journals and the periodicals as well, or is it primarily just meant for the newspaper articles?
Because of the period I'm looking at, there's so much overlap that it would be quite myopic to only look at newspapers. I mean, most of the human interest stories, I'll say, eventually appear in magazines or are sometimes taken from magazines. There was one I found that was actually 37 years old. He must have just had a volume on the shelf and needed another column in that particular particular issue of his newspaper, and he changed the names of all the aristocrats so they were modern aristocrats instead of the early Georgian ones. But yeah, it's the periodical material. It shows up and is reprinted, so it would be foolish not to include it at some point.
Yeah.
Are you able to detect any regionalisms in things like spelling, even vocabulary, as things move around the British Isles, or is standardised by the state?
It's not standardized. Different types of stories are interesting to different groups. Maritime stories will go from port to port, but they don't survive inland very often. Glasgow is really, not so much Edinburgh, but Glasgow's really good at finding the one Scot anywhere in the world and finding that article and putting it in their newspaper. It's incredible. I couldn't have done it as well as he does it. So yeah, there are variations. I would say that it's overlapping between regional and political. So you get networks that are Scottish networks and you get networks that are Whig networks. And they kind of have, like the Caledonian Mercury is kind of a hub for both, but they kind of circulate and get changed within those sub-networks in different ways.
I'd only just offer, I'm working in, on my PhD on a corner in Ireland in County Monaghan, so that in terms of 19th century newspapers, because it's in Ulster, a lot of times that gets copied, and I started seeing the pattern of the different newspapers, and also a connection with Scotland and certain newspapers there. It makes it very difficult, and in terms of, you think that it would be in Southern Ireland where all with the new Irish newspapers archive that's now been launched,
Yeah.
and combining it with the British newspapers archive. It isn't. So I just wanted to say, a lot of the complexities that you've mentioned, although painful, are a relief that I can complement your work in the sense that I have experienced those exact things.
Yeah, I mean, the two networks or the two databases that I'm really looking forward to working with are the Welsh National Library and the Australian National Library, because they've also made their data available for free online. So hopefully I can slowly expand it out. And if any commercial digitizers are watching, I would love to look at your data.
Sorry, also in terms of the networks and the information flows or the reprinting, is it then the case really that London does it constitute sort of a hub that it spreads out from London? I don't know, because you showed this article from the Sydney Gazette. So would it always come to these international news to London and then distributed around the country, or is it not so?
It depends on where it came from. If it came from Australia, 99% of the time it went through London until about 1840. And then the provinces, I use that anywhere that's not London, the provincial press started getting their own connections. But until then, it's pretty much coming through London. The United States and Canada, you have Quebec papers and New York papers and some Virginia papers, and they develop kind of personal relationships with certain towns in Britain. So there are lots and lots of independent networks. London is a good hub because it gets a lot of the continental news first, and it translates it. And the smaller papers don't have their own translation staff. So if it's Parisian news or Austrian news, a lot of times London's the best hub just for translation service.
And that's the case even though the Telegraph comes in and we don't physically have to ship the news on boats anymore?
See, yes. The Telegraph in the 1840s, my project only goes up to the 1840s. But yeah, it does change it, but it changes it for time-sensitive news. Anything that's about the colonies, how things are developing, human interest stories, that's not valuable enough to go on the Telegraph. So it follows those old patterns almost until the 20th century. It's just time-sensitive war, epidemic kind of news, stock prices really, that the Telegraph really dominates for that sort of thing, and utterly disrupts all the networks. So, and you can't tell where it came from. The nice thing about this period is that a physical copy has to move, so you can physically trace it a lot easier, and the evolution it takes.
I have a question online from James Baker. Can you, and it isn't about the red green, although we did tweet about that. Can you say something about the distinction between dailies, such as Morning Chronicle, and weeklies, such as the Examiner, in relation to reprints? Do they stick out in the data?
Yes, the dailies tend to be a really good source. They don't tend to reprint each other very much. They tend to get in coroner's inquests or intelligence from ship captains they know, or personal letters. The weeklies tend to be really, really good at choosing the best and for making thematic collections. So you'll get a page of all the news from the frontier from Kentucky, and he's taking it from like 7 or 8 different London papers. So there's a huge difference in terms of how cohesive the weeklies actually appear compared to the dailies, which tend to just, I mean, not to be mean to the dailies, but they tend to throw a lot in their 15 pages, the Morning Chronicle. And so it, you do get a different flavor for how the reprinting process works. And the Morning Chronicle does reprint, but it tends to be less reprinting and more finding news in the metropole itself.
Would it be, I can't think of a good 19th century word to describe this. Would it be like uncool for a major London newspaper to steal from a crappy little outpost newspaper?
It would be uncool to be caught. They do. They London papers, the big London papers, there's certain ones like the Morning Chronicle and the Courier to a lesser extent, where they don't attribute very much, and they tend to be near the top of the food chain. They don't get things later on in the reprint cycle. Yeah, they do complain about other people reprinting from them as well if they don't want to compete with other London newspapers. They do steal occasionally from other port towns, and I think that's, personally, I think it's because they don't get caught. Because somebody who has a subscription to the Glasgow Advertiser probably won't also have a subscription to the London Examiner, and so it's just good news as opposed to being unfashionable within the London circles. But there are other London papers that are just complete, all they are is reprints, and they're perfectly happy with that.
I was wondering, Melodee, if you could say something, well, to probe you a little bit about advertisements, because you kind of said you want them out in that sense. What can be so? Well,
It should be their own project.
Well, and that's the question. Did you not find anything that was redeemable about kind of investigating the advertisements, since there's so much a part of what's there?
Well, okay, so I would retract. If I had 3 lifetimes, I would love to do the advertisements, because there were some that were really interesting. There were some tutors, some maths and geography tutors, who were advertising like in every tiny newspaper in the country, and they must have been really desperate for work. There were certain patent medicines, obviously they get published in certain places, but you can tell sort of the post-road networks and the personal kinship networks of these various bookshops by where these advertisements for random things appear, and they were really, really interesting, but I've only got 1 lifetime. So my plea was for somebody to take it up so it doesn't disappear.
Research project with lots of PhDs.
Yes, absolutely. Because there's lots of interesting stuff, and especially the fact that things that I wouldn't think of as commodities still had stock phrases for how you describe a tutor, how you describe ladies' stockings, how you describe certain things. Vastly different parts of the country using the same language.
The stuff that you're looking at is obviously part of the newspapers,
Mm-hmm.
and you might say this is cultural history. But it also, I mean, do you see this also as part of an infrastructural history? I mean, can this be part of a larger narrative of the ways that parts of the country were connected and not? Or is this more about individual relationships, and the guy in Edinburgh has a subscription to the such and such?
It tells you a lot about transportation networks, just by how quickly news appears in other places, who gets news first because of how post roads worked or didn't work on particular days or times of the year. It tells you a lot about commerce and shipping, because these newspapers from other parts of the world, you know, they were a bundle in the back of a ship that was bringing tobacco or bringing other things. And it tells you interesting things about how the print trade works. The reason that so many Australian newspapers stopped coming through London is because all the provincial newspaper apprentices go off to Australia, set up their own newspapers, and start sending stuff back to their old bosses. So you can map these networks onto other networks in really interesting ways, and it kind of shows evidence of how they worked. It also shows really good evidence of just migration networks, because so much of the colonial news is a local person in our town has received a letter from a friend who's moved here. And so it helps you connect local communities in different parts of the world because of correspondence. So I think it's really helpful in terms of finding networks that may have been lost in other evidences. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions from the floor? All right, well, thank you very much, Melodee, for coming down to London and sharing your project with us. We have another seminar coming up in the future, just to advertise while everybody's still listening. Our next seminar is going to be Bob Nicholson, who some of you will know. He's at Edge Hill University, and he is coming on the 10th of November, which will be another Tuesday. And he's going to be talking about his project, the Victorian Meme Machine. So that's building on some of the groundwork that you laid for us today, Melodee. So please do join us again on the 10th. And for those of you who are joining us online, I'm afraid that's as far as your evening is going to take you. But thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
And if anybody would like to join us for a quick drink at the pub, then we will be heading over that direction. And Melodee, I don't know if you've got time or not, but thank you very much for coming along either way. And thank you to Melodee.